The most important issue facing Americans today is not trade wars, it's not China, it's not wokeism. It is the fact that the United States federal government intends on borrowing another $86 trillion over the next 10 years, which is an absolute impossibility, quite frankly. And today, my guests and I get into what exactly it's going to look like when we run right off that cliff. Her name is Maya MacGuineas, and she is the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I bet you didn't know such a committee actually exists, but they are adamantly nonpartisan and fully focused on the most important issue facing America today, the budget. Here's Maya MacGuineas on The Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
Here I am with Maya MacGuineas. Maya, thanks so much for making the time. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. Me too.
So let's start here. President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. If anybody is paying attention to the government balance sheet, they may be surprised that such a committee exists. So I'd love to start there. What is the mission behind the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and what is your role involved?
Got it. Great. Yeah, fair point that it doesn't exactly reflect in the debt levels that are out there. So this is a group that's been around for decades, actually. It started in the early 80s, and it was started by a couple members of Congress when they were leaving, bipartisan, which is a huge part of it, who are frustrated by the inability to budget well. And so I think the distinctive quality about the committee is, one, that we're truly bipartisan. People say that, don't always mean that. We really are. We have a team of staff here who probably has voted for every person in the primaries, totally runs the gamut. But we have this board of directors of folks who have been in office and worked on these issues, whether it was as the head of the Fed or the Office of Management and Budget or Congressional Budget Office or in Congress. So they actually really understand how difficult being fiscally responsible is. So we try to approach it with this is one of the harder asks out there, to actually legislate and put in policies that are fiscally responsible. How do the people who understand how this works, how do they recommend we do it? So we work really closely with our board. But the things we do is we focus on policy. We put out lots of papers about the budget. We focus on legislation. We work with members in a bipartisan way as often as possible, but all members on making bills more fiscally responsible. And we have an outside game where we try to work in the state so that we educate people and hopefully they convey to their members of Congress that they care about this issue, because a lot of people can be pretty silent on it. I sometimes worry I'm the only person who goes and votes basically on the two least popular things, but who is going to cut my spending the most and who is going to raise my taxes the most. And those are the bottom line things we're going to have to do if we want to deal with this debt situation. But they're politically difficult. And so that's the role of the committee, is to try to push for them more.
Yeah, I would have asked you, why is it so difficult? And maybe that's an obvious question for a lot of folks, but you just answered it right, because it's difficult. You have to vote to cut your spending and increase your taxes. And who is actually going to do that?
Right. So, I mean, this is the thing. Fiscal responsibility is a phenomenal talking point. Nobody should be saying, oh, I want to be fiscally reckless. So it's something that people have signed on to. However, the real willingness to approach those issues, it's not just Republicans want to cut spending and Democrats want to raise taxes. The truth is neither of them want to do either. And so the issue is, how do you move past the talking points into a budgeting process that really pushes us not to add to the debt? And I'll talk a little bit more about when it's okay to borrow, when it's not. But trying to create a politically honest discussion is very difficult, because you have so many members of Congress who really want to be fiscally responsible, but when they're faced with the actual choices, they're like, I guess I will pretend that tax cuts pay for themselves, which they don't. They pay for a small portion of the lost revenue, but they don't pay for themselves. Or I'll pretend that something like MMT is true, where you can just print money and not worry about it. Couldn't be farther from the truth. So they end up going to what I call the free lunch theories instead of the real budgetary trade-offs, which is the thing we have to get back to. If something's important enough to do, and we agree as a country that it's something the federal government should do, we need to figure out a way to pay for it. And those simple principles of budgeting is really where the answers to a lot of this lie. But we are very far away from that being the norm in politics and budgeting these days.
Are you noticing, I don't know if I'd call it a groundswell, but a bit more coverage in the mega mainstream media? And I mean like MSNBC and Fox, like up at that level, I'm hearing conversations about the debt, about the deficit that I haven't maybe ever heard before. Now, I'm not sure if that's just me, or do you see a bit of a sentiment shift? Because politics follows media to a degree, right? And if nobody is covering the story, no one's going to care about it, and no politician's going to run on that issue. But what do you think? Is there a bit of a shift in public understanding and sentiment that's reflected somewhere?
Totally agree. I've been really encouraged. Well, no, I can't say totally encouraged, because the reason that it's getting more coverage is because things are getting worse. There's a big deterioration and there's a lot of risk. But yes, this is an issue that comes and goes in waves. And there was a period around 2010 where there was a big commission, Simpson Bowles, for anybody who remembers back to that, where they worked on this issue. The issue had a lot of attention. Things didn't get implemented. The commission recommendations weren't adopted. And people had worked so hard and tried so hard. Basically, members of Congress just gave up. And they were like, we're not talking about this for a while. And interest rates stayed really low. And so people were able to pretend like, it doesn't matter. Look, we have big budget deficits, but the interest rates are low. Maybe we can borrow all we want, which is where some of the more nutty theories came out about don't worry, just borrow more. However, I think this changed massively. I mean, we borrowed trillions during COVID, which was important to do. Like there are times you have to borrow. And a huge pandemic when your economy shut down is one of them. So it was really important that we're able to borrow, but our debt jumped up massively during that period. And then, of course, really importantly, we hit 9.1% inflation. And related to that, interest rates went up. That is the Achilles heels of deficit denial. Because what happened is we've borrowed so much now, and our debt is at near record levels, that when interest rates go up even a little bit, it pushes up our interest payments massively. And this is the thing that actually gets people's attention the most, growing government interest payments. I remember many years ago, we did some polling on this issue of what would make people care about the deficit and debt. And I thought the answer was going to be like your kids, your grandkids. Nope. No one cares about their kids and grandkids. What they care about is government interest payments. And that really concerns them when interest rates go up and the government's spending a lot on interest payments. And a lot of that is going overseas because we've borrowed from overseas. So that is the wake up call that got people paying more attention. And then very recently, and I'm sure you're well attuned to this, but with the jump up in the 10-year, and when we saw that the demand for 10-year was causing rates to go up, that was very concerning because that has big effects on the whole economy and it has big effects on our interest payments. So if we have interest rates that go up just 1 percentage point more than they're anticipated to, that adds about $300 billion a year to our interest costs. And right now, interest payments, and these are stunning facts, but interest payments are the second largest item in the federal budget. The only thing we spend more money on is Social Security. So interest just got larger than national defense. That is a huge cause for concern in many sectors because I don't believe there's ever been an economy that maintained sort of a superpower status once they were paying more in interest than they were on national defense. And related, interest is the single fastest growing part of the federal budget. And we are incredibly vulnerable to rates. If they go up, those interest payments will go up even more quickly. So that's where a lot of the cause for concern is for anyone who's paying attention to this. But if not, the 10-year sort of woke up a lot of folks in the financial community as well.
And that makes sense. And the interest payment, I'm surprised by that as well. But simultaneously, I found myself thinking about it and I'm like, well, everybody understands the impact of interest payments because we have credit cards and mortgages and car loans and all this stuff. So we get that concept. Then to see $1 trillion in government interest paid out every year, maybe that just slaps people in the face with it seems like gross mismanagement and inefficiency. You're like, that's a number that just seems grossly wrong, and therefore people can nod their head in agreement and say, okay, we have to do something. Now, the doing something parts where things get really, really tricky. And looking at today, we've got sort of I'd love to know your thoughts on this, two levers in the game. One being, an administration that ran on the Doge activity, right? We're going to find a way to make the government more efficient. The Department of Government Efficiency is doing their best. I'd love to talk about that, but simultaneously,
I'm sorry, I should have brought up that Doge is a huge reason that's put this issue on the agenda. You're absolutely right. So I'm glad we'll talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The effectiveness or not of them. I know they can make suggestions, but can't actually enact things. So it's, maybe on the periphery, but we'll get into the impact they're making or not making. But simultaneously, this new big, beautiful bill is set to increase the deficit by $370 billion per year, 3.7 trillion over the next 10. Two things happening at once, and one seems way more impactful than the other. What's your take on, we talked about media maybe discussing the government debt a bit more, public understanding it better, but are you seeing any actual political actions of substance?
So many good questions packed into there. I hope I get to all of them. If I forget them, re-ask them.
Yeah.
There are tons of good points. And I do just want to reiterate, Doge, I mean, that's where all the headlines was. That's where all the oxygen was. And suddenly people are like, yeah, we have got to do this. We've got to look through the federal budget line by line and figure out what's useful and what's not, which is a exercise I completely agree with. I'm not sure it's been enacted perfectly, but I completely agree. I Doge everything now. I Doge all my my streaming subscriptions. I Doge my closet. I'm totally bought in on the idea of Doge. And then I hope that it leads to more savings than it appears that it's going to. But there was a problem with that. And that was that it led everybody to think, oh, we just have to get rid of waste in the government and this is going to be easy. And I guess, somebody once said, our group, we're the skunk at the garden party. And it's really kind of true because no matter what answer someone always has, we're like, yeah, but really it comes back down to we're going to have to make some hard choices. We should get rid of every bit of waste that we can find and inefficiencies and certainly fraud and abuse in the federal government. And there's a significant amount. More of it is in areas that haven't been looked at as closely. I would say healthcare delivery system is one of the places where you could have the most savings. Another area is in defense procurement. I think defense spending may well have to go up as the world gets riskier, but there's certainly savings to be had there. And Doge was focusing on smaller things and some of the big items, but still important to get started there. But it becomes really difficult to link this issue in what people hear about from politicians into reality. And that goes sort of to how politicians talk about it and how the media covers it. So everybody will again say fiscal responsibility, that's a good thing, that's an important thing. And we look through everything of the lens of fiscal responsibility. The way you get there means trade-offs and dealing with them. And as soon as people sort of talk about that, then they're like, but don't touch Social Security, don't touch Medicare. They describe what's going on with Medicaid right now in the reconciliation bills, which we'll talk about, as slashing Medicaid, even though I think that's probably not the right description of the policies that they're talking about. And absolutely no raising taxes. So many people have signed off on no taxes at all or no taxes on people under 400,000. A lot of promises that basically don't add up. However, when the media is covering this issue, the first thing, if they're talking to a politician, they will play gotcha with, aren't you touching Social Security? Isn't that raising taxes? And so there is an echo chamber reinforcing there's no actual thank you for truly being fiscally responsible, right? So we'll talk about it and say it's really important, but when somebody puts out the policy to do it, hey, here's a fix for Social Security, they are attacked before they have finished explaining the policy, unless it's a pretend policy. The only fiscal responsibility is honestly going to be something that somebody's like, ooh, that's not really something I want to do. Someone said to me the other day, so you want to do these Medicaid cuts? Oh my gosh, no, I don't want to cut anything. And I certainly don't want to pay more in taxes. But once you've studied the damage that federal budget deficits do, you realize that the risk of not doing these choices now and delaying them has very, very severe consequences for the economy, for our national security, for our ability to budget in the future, for our ability to make good on promises. We can talk more about why it matters, but we're going to have to do some things we don't want to in the short run to get to a much stronger economy, more vibrant country. Really, I hate to sound like I'm exaggerating, but I do believe we don't remain a superpower if we lose control of our fiscal situation. And we are approaching that really quite quickly at this point. So the media picks up on things, people in the markets pick up on things, but they still aren't really fully grasping what it takes to go through those things. Like when I look at markets right now, they desperately want a debt improvement, and they also desperately want all the tax cuts to be extended and then some. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, but in order to do that, you have to cut a lot of spending. And to put the spending cuts in perspective, now we'll switch to the reconciliation. Nobody wants to do real spending cuts. So over the budget window or the next decade, we will spend $86 trillion. The federal government will spend $86 trillion. The House and the Senate have each come up with these reconciliation bills that are being discussed and debated right now. The far more fiscally responsible House bill out of that $86 trillion, and these are all folks who say they are small government conservatives because this is a Republican-only bill. And let me again just say, I'm diehard bipartisan. I'm a political independent. I don't have a dog in this fight. Like, I have total respect for both approaches. But folks who are saying they are small government conservatives are only aspiring to cut $2 trillion out of $86 trillion total. What? That is a rounding error. That is so little in spending reductions. Now, they're not looking at the full area of the budget, which would make it a lot easier. But that's a tiny, it's not a spending cut. It is just slowing the growth. Spending will go up dramatically under a budget that the House or Senate is looking at. So if the Senate, if the House weren't kind of flimsy enough and like, $2 trillion out of 86, the Senate is aspiring to $4 billion with a B, which isn't even a rounding error. It doesn't even make it into the rounding error category. It's so small. So there's this problem that nobody has the courage of their convictions when they talk about what they want in terms of the hard parts of the government. I want to cut spending. I'm Irene on cutting spending. You hear all the time. Revenues aren't the problem. Spending is the problem. Okay, let's cut some spending. We've actually put out lists of tens of trillions of dollars of potential spending cuts. Again, they're not easy, but they're what you have to do when you want to get a debt under control or offset the costs of new tax cuts. And there's very little appetite to do that. So the result, the bottom line, is that both these bills that are being discussed in Congress would add trillions, anywhere from 3 trillion to 7 trillion. And it could start to grow because a lot of the policies they're kind of cramming in there are temporary. But if you extend them, they'd be even more. We're talking about adding, give or take, $3 to $7 trillion in new borrowing. That's insanity, given the fact that our debt is at near record levels. Our interest payments are at warning across the board, be careful. Our deficits are over $2 trillion a year, the highest as a share of GDP they've ever been in a non-emergency period. There is no plausible defense for doing anything fiscally now other than reducing the amount of borrowing. We already are planning. If we do nothing, we will borrow $22 trillion over the next decade. That's how much already is baked in because of the automatic growth in our spending programs and the fact that revenues aren't high enough to offset them. So $22 trillion over the next decade, we should be putting in place policies that reduce that, not increase that. And there is no framework that's being discussed as part of reconciliation that would come close to reducing even $1 of borrowing. And that's the cause for concern, the huge mismatch between the fiscal situation and the political situation.
The smartest investors know that real wins come from thinking independently and spotting opportunities long before the crowd. And that's what we teach at the Commodity University.
Now, I'm struggling a little bit to find ways to steelman what you're saying, but
yeah.
I want to try. And let's say,
Good.
There's a correlation between reduced taxes and increased productivity, and the trickle. That's the trickle down economics argument.
Mm-hmm.
You must hear that. What do you say when somebody pushes back and say, no, if you reduce the tax burden on the citizens, you'll unlock so much more investable capital that will boost productivity, and the net increase will offset the lost revenue.
I, as much as anybody, wish that were true, because wouldn't that be fun? If it's like, we need more revenue, let's cut some taxes. And that was really the answer. So here's what happens. If you cut taxes, you will increase economic growth, because particularly if they're the right taxes to cut. So the ones on income, work, savings, those kinds of things, you will increase growth. The range you will increase growth by enough to offset roughly 20 to 25% of the lost revenue. not 100%, which is what it would take to pay for something completely, but say a quarter, fifth to a quarter. That's if it's pro-growth tax cuts. Unfortunately, the biggest pro-growth tax cuts were already made permanent. I guess that's not unfortunate. That's good. The ones that we're talking about extending now are not the more pro-growth ones. So it's going to be on the lower end of that spectrum or even less. But so if what we should do is score it dynamically, like if let's see how much growth this is going to generate, and you don't need to offset that, but you need to offset the difference, which is roughly 80% of the tax bill. So if you're increasing the borrowing in a bill by $5 trillion, you would need to find $4 trillion in offsets. What's going on in it, right? So it's not as good as 100, not even close to as good as 100. What's going on in this bill is that they're assuming about $2.6 trillion would come from growth. Outside estimators have assumed that the amount of growth we'd get would range from negative 50 to 710 billion. So that 2.6 is many multiples of the single highest outside estimate and many, many multiples of the average. The reason the estimates aren't higher, and it gets worse over time, if you cut taxes, it will grow the economy by some amount. But if you debt finance it, that additional debt has negative effects on the economy from crowding out, because the government has to borrow more, which means there's less available to be invested in the private sector to create that kind of growth you were just bringing up. The higher your debt level is, the more negative effect there is from borrowing things. If we cut taxes and fully offset them, so we actually, or even offset them by a little bit more, so we reduce the debt and reduce taxes, that would be a lot more pro-growth, right? So it's the deficit finance parting that subtracts a lot of the growth that you would get. Even then, it still wouldn't be 100%, but it would be a lot more. So it's I think one of the things, the weaknesses of this issue is it's just complicated to go through and explain that. Like, it's a lot easier just to say, cut taxes will grow the economy. And it sounds pretty plausible. But the truth is the growth that we would get from cutting these taxes, economic growth projected to be about 1.8% for the coming decade. The reason it's not higher is we've got demographics working against us, the aging of the population. If you looked at the growth from tax cuts, it's still going to be 1.9. It's not going to be 3%, which is, it's the kinds of things that we might want. That's not even in the realm of possibility. Now, it is for 1 year. And we've seen in the past, you can cut taxes. You'll get some strong growth for 1 year, but that's because the debt impacts take longer to phase in. You need that growth for every year for 10 years to actually offset it.
Right.
So again, skunk at every party. I wish we could. Give me more great ideas. I wish we could do them. But if it's too easy, it's not actually how you balance a budget, or not balance a budget. We're not even going to do that, but bring down a $29/36 trillion debt. It's not going to be easy. And so whenever people only have easy solutions, they're almost certain not to be the full story.
Yeah.
Give me more though. I love to.
Yeah. Well, political narratives often, they sound great. You nod your head intuitively. That makes sense. And you dig one level deeper into the logistics. You're like, oh, this whole thing breaks down. None of this actually makes any sense. So we need to spend less. We talked about defense, probably not going to go down. I would assume could be spent a lot more efficiently. But
yes, huge defense shift, right? I mean, I think that there's going to be demands for more national security issues, cyber defense, things like that. But there's so much savings to be had also. So before we start piling in new money, we should doge the Defense Department for sure.
Yeah, right. And just, get more return on every dollar spent. There's probably 25-50% unlocked. Who knows? There's something unlocked.
But like big dollars. I believe we could have significant savings if you really dug in. Now, it's hard. The other element of Washington and all of this is there are very vested interests who profit from systems these ways. One person's waste is somebody's profit. And it's politically hard to tackle. But if we could take that aside, let's go really dig into where the savings in defense are before we start piling in new money, I would agree.
Yeah. One person's waste is somebody's margin. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we could look at Social Security, as you mentioned, increase the retirement age to 70 years old. That's going to offend sort of the voter base in a big way and probably relatively unpalatable. What would it look like? Here's, I guess, where I understand less. What would like a 20% reduction in Medicaid spending actually look like for the average American? Like how there's some money to be saved there probably, but there's going to be some conflict. What is that conflict and how would that materialize for the public?
Yeah. Let me answer that. And then I also want to go back to your Social Security comment, because I'm going to push back and say Social Security is one of the places we have to reform it, and we can and we should reform it. So we'll go to that. But and you said Medicaid for the savings.
Yes.
So in each one of these policies, and we're kind of policy neutral, like we just focus on, we don't say this is the right policy, this is the wrong policy, because again, we're so nonpartisan and we have this singular goal of we are borrowing too much. We have to bring our debt levels down. It is going to have severe consequences for the economy and households and the standard of living if we don't. So we try to stay neutral on the policies. However, any area of savings or taxes, there are pretty clearly better or worse ways to do things. And so when it comes with Medicaid, the way that you would start, and I think that the work and the reconciliation bill has done a pretty good job of trying to find some of these areas. Now, I think there are things like work requirements, which people would definitely debate, but eligibility requirements make sense. But there is a lot of gaming of the Medicaid system because the federal government gives grants to the states. There's a lot of gaming that goes on where the states have come up with a plan where they put taxes on some of their hospitals, some of the Medicaid providers. They recoup those taxes and then they give more back to the providers. But in recouping them, they've increased the cost and they've increased how much the federal government is sending to the states. There is a huge gaming thing going on here from provider taxes that could literally save $700 billion. I mean, that is where we should, huge. And numbers and savings aren't that big. They're usually like, we could save $4 billion. They're usually small. This is a huge amount of money. Now, people would say, well, that's still going to affect beneficiaries because the states are going to spend less on Medicaid. That's true. Nothing's free. I don't want to be the free lunch person myself. Like, it will mean that the states will have to pick up more of what they're spending. They may be spending that on Medicaid. They may be diverting it somewhere else. But if you think what the states are spending money on is good, which it certainly is going to be in some people's eyes, that will reduce the amount of money. But I think we've gotten into a dangerous habit now where we act like states can't do anything because the federal government has to give them the money. So whenever we talk about different policies, I think it's okay to say the state should have a role in that. That's a different discussion. But 100%, they shouldn't be gaming the federal policy on Medicaid. So you could do some real savings there without having big changes in the actual program. After that, though, I mean, you can't get tons of savings for free. But that's where I would start.
Could I just pull on that, just the mechanics of it a little bit? So, the states spend on Medicaid. They receive effectively like a rebate from the federal government. And there's a bit of a gap there in what's actually been spent and what's being recouped. That's the waste and fraud that you're referring to. Does that, am I close? What am I missing?
You're close. So the way that it works is that the states get matches, and they get different matches for different populations. So it's not one clear match, but they get matches from the federal government. So the government pays a different portion for things. And it's based on their total Medicaid spending. And they have found a way to bump up their what the total Medicaid spending appears to be in a way that they don't actually have to spend it because it goes to taxes and then the taxes go back to the providers. Okay. And so it's basically a way that, like, if you're padding your bill that you're submitting to somebody, making it look like you spent a lot more than you did, that's what's happening. And then the federal government is matching more than it should be.
So who would be the beneficiary of that waste? Who's receiving that?
The states. The state government.
The state governments. The state governments, yeah. Okay.
Right. And then because dollars are fungible, they have a little bit of flexibility even where that gets spent.
Got it.
This has been one of the things they've done a lot of digging on this. And I thought they were going to get more savings out of it this time. They've looked at a tiny part of it, but not nearly as much as they could have. But it's the kind of thing, we sit, we are a group that tries to convince politicians things, but we're really a policy group. And we sit with all other policy experts. And there are certain policies that everybody kind of agrees on. I'm actually thinking of how to build something like a budget offsets bank where you have a bunch of outsiders who all say, like, well, this is a good one. This is good. If you're going to do healthcare reforms, this would be a smarter one. And if you're going to get rid of some of the tax expenditures, these are the ones we should get rid of, because there's a lot of overlap in the policy community along the political spectrum. And I'm thinking if we create that may give some cover for the politicians who ultimately have to make those choices. We will help you to sort of pick out which policies are better than others in terms of, better is a subjective word, but things that would do the least damage to the economy, seem the most fair to the most people. There are a lot of ways that we've designed policies that aren't smart. So we should start with improving them to generate savings.
I see. And that would be a tricky one, because this isn't, back to the Medicaid rebate scenario, this isn't a lobby group. It's not a big corporation or industry gaming the government. It's another government agency effectively gaming a different government agency. So yeah, that's a tricky one.
Okay. Right. They always say you need a bad guy, and there's not. And like if somebody's ripping off Medicaid, if they have stolen a Social Security number and they're ripping off Medicaid, there's a bad guy. But a lot of these things aren't bad guys. They're policy designs that are not as efficient as they should be, but somebody is benefiting from them. And so.
Okay. So backing up to Social Security, then we could raise the Social Security retirement age to 70 years old. That would save somewhere between like 100 to 150 billion a year, something like this. A big number, a really big number. Would probably not be popular with older voters, but you see this as something that needs to be looked at and actioned in some way. And just maybe to back up, Social Security is sort of a recent experiment. This isn't a very long-standing. What's your take?
Social Security's been around since 1935. What's your definition of long?
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's pretty long. I think and either way, it's kind of a bedrock of our retirement system, and seniors depend on it. And I know of all the issues I discuss, it's the one where my father jumps out of his seat and starts yelling at me I paid in, keep your hands off my Social Security.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So I think it is a program that makes a ton of sense. One of the beauties of Social Security is that it provides annuities, an annuity-like system, in that you're not going to outlive what Social Security pays you, because it will pay you until you die. And so it's insurance against living too long, outliving your savings. I know when I look at retirement, I'm like, okay, it really makes a difference. Are you living to be 70 or are you living to be 99? Mm-hmm. Huge difference. Social Security insures against that. That's incredibly useful. And it does many things. It lifted seniors out of, they used to be the highest group in poverty. Now they're the lowest. The highest group in poverty is children now. So it is an incredibly beneficial program. It is, however, going to become insolvent. And in 9 years, the program, which puts money, it's not giving you back your money. It's not a savings program. The program is financed by payroll taxes, FICA, and that money is put in a trust fund, and that those dollars are then used to pay benefits. It will soon be the case that we do not bring in enough in taxes to cover the benefits, with including what's available to take out of the trust fund. We already pay out more in benefits than we take in taxes each year, but we have this trust fund that we're drawing down. In 9 years, that will be depleted. At that point, and this is what politicians cover up all over the place, at that point, benefits will be automatically reduced across the board for everybody by 21%. That is the legal situation that we face right now. So explain to me how it's okay that we have both candidates running for president promising not to touch or fix Social Security. We should be all over this, making changes to Social Security. It's not about the deficit on this one. It's about avoiding these huge costs of insolvency. So one, we have to do something. And the longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be. Now, into the solutions. You talked about raising the retirement age. Absolutely. I think we should raise the retirement age. When the program started, the retirement age was 65 and life expectancy was 62. So it was like, okay, that works. Mm-hmm. They the warning was that the first Social Security recipient ended up living to be 100. so
really? Is that the case? The first recipient?
Ida Mae Fuller lived to be 100. Yeah. Oops.
She gamed the system right there.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully she had a good long life. So anyhow, now we're all living to be, knock wood, we're all living to be in our 70s and our 80s or in our 90s, and that's probably likely to grow. So you got to raise the retirement age, in that we don't have the resources to pay for people to be in retirement for a third of their life and more. But you certainly don't raise it for anybody who's about to retire. And so that's the thing, is that this is grandfathered. You have a ton of younger people who don't think they're getting Social Security at all. That's not true. They are. It's still there for them. It's just that it's not what's been promised. But for people who are younger, I think we raise the retirement age because you can only afford to support, so many working years for so many retirement years. It's just that you have to not do it for somebody who is 65 and about to retire tomorrow.
Right.
That's one thing. But I think there are a lot of others that won't fix it on its own, for sure. Even less so if we postpone when it starts. You also have to look at slowing the growth of benefits for the well-off. I think it's going to become a program. Right now, those who make more money get much larger Social Security benefits. We're just not going to be able to afford that. And when I go and talk to people around the country, they're always like, yeah, if I don't need Social Security, I shouldn't have to get it. I want it there in case I need it. Most people I talk to are very happy for it to be more of an insurance program. So if you need it, so you want to restructure the benefits. You could raise the payroll tax cap, which is the amount of money that goes into the program. And you can change the way we calculate inflation, which overstates inflation. Something called change CPI. Together, those four things, I think, would fix Social Security. But the point I guess I would make, we've got a bunch of politicians, and I don't like to say lying, but are really, really abusing their responsibility by not fixing this system. Every one of them knows every single year the trustees of Social Security put out an annual report. Anyone can go read it. I read it, and I learned so much from reading it. And it says, this program will become insolvent, benefits will be cut, and we need to make changes sooner rather than later. I think it's unconscionable that our politicians are not in there fixing it right now. It's not a last minute fix. You need to phase these changes in, and every one of them should have their plan to fix Social Security, because it's really hard if someone starts to talk about it and they're met with people demagoguing, you're gonna touch Social Security. It's a political deal killer, and the ARP phone banking in their districts and setting angry and scared seniors on them. They're trying to scare seniors when nobody's talking about changing benefits for current retirees. But they are talking about we have to make changes in the future to avoid these across the board benefit cuts.
And 9 years is like eons in political years, because even whoever wins the 2028 election, they could still, in the back of their mind, be like, it's not my problem.
Not my problem.
It's not my problem, right? It's not going to get me elected. Cutting that. Absolutely not.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the biggest, this is a really, I have said this like 100 times to you already, but this is a really tough issue. And the problem is that telling the truth isn't going to get people elected. And one of the things I'm really pondering is how you change that, how you create the norms that people understand sort of the truth. We have to have a budget. We have got to bring our debt down. We cannot let our debt surpass the record as a share of GDP, which was set right after World War II, which we are about to pass in just 4 years. That is not good for our country. It's going to slow economic growth. It's going to increase interest payments. It's going to keep us from making our budget more flexible. As things like technology change the whole way that we think about the economy and where disruptions are and what the social contract needs to be, we can't change our budget because we're so locked in with interest payments growing faster than anything else. And it's going to risk our national security when we have to borrow from countries with whom we're not aligned. And they could use dumping treasuries. They could weaponize that. It's a very vulnerable position we've put ourselves in. We need to stop. We need to change course. It's gotten to the point where I don't think that should be up for discussion. So the question is how? And there are lots of different approaches. That's what people are going to fight out because none of them are good. But we just need to have a given. And actually, Secretary Bessent from the Treasury has put out the goal I think makes sense. He said, we have got to get our budget deficit to 3% of GDP. I wish we were shooting to balance it, but balancing it would take $17 trillion in savings over the next 10 years. The most we've saved ever, or in the past decade at one time, was $1.5 trillion. We're not going to save $17 trillion. Mm-hmm. But getting it to 3% of GDP would be about $7.5 trillion. Heavy lift, doable, and it would certainly reassure markets. So I just think it should be a non-negotiable. If I could get people to sign a pledge, it would be, I will not sign legislation that involves more borrowing until the debt is under control. We should pay for what we do. That's just the simple start.
But as long as voters get to choose a leader based on what's in their immediate best interest every 4 years, I think it's plausible that doesn't happen, right?
It is very plausible that doesn't happen. Yeah.
So we end up in a scenario where we have austerity as a potential solution, but it's very, very unlikely.
Painful.
Default on our debt, maybe eventually, hopefully not, but
that won't even fix it because we'll still have to borrow. Even if we defaulted, we still have to borrow the next week because we're structurally dependent on borrowing. And if we defaulted, interest rates would soar.
Yeah.
So defaulting would make it much worse very quickly.
So the more likely policy is continued currency debasement for as long as we can. Is that the most probable outcome during this stage of empire? If we look back at sort of the Dutch and the British and now the American, we're at this place that we've been before on other continents. What do you think?
Well, gosh, it makes me sort of queasy to think about the most likely outcome not being that politicians will come together and do what we need. But I think the most likely outcome is that we will have a jump up in inflation and or interest rates, and that will cause enough pain very quickly. It'll be very painful if that happens. Because not just like we just been through inflation, that's not fun. But on top of that, the interest payments in the budget pushing things out. So we have to either do immediate austerity or borrow more. Then we get in this dangerous cycle. And I think the best thing we could do is have a plan ready to go so that if inflation pops up or interest rates pop up, here is like a blueprint of the least objectionable, like I was saying, like a bunch of things that outsiders have said. It's sort of like an outside fiscal commission, basically, but saying if we had to suddenly save $5 trillion, this is the best way to do it. 50% revenue, 50% spending. These are the easiest things to do. These are the quickest things to do that wouldn't be damaging to the economy. Like have that ready to go. But I think the most likely is that a spike up in interest rates or inflation is what pushes us to do the right thing, but we've waited much longer than we should have, and it will be much harder than it should be.
Yeah.
If we had done this quite some time ago when people started warning about it, people would have barely noticed. It would have been very small changes spread out over a lot of time. We've lost the window for that, and that's painful to realize.
For those that might say, all we need is like a really wild productivity boom. We could grow our way out of this, right? Mm-hmm. And an analogy that sometimes I use, it's kind of clunky, but I think in the turn of the 19th century, the British Empire had just lost the American colonies and all of the industry that they provided. And inflation in London was like 30% in the year 1800. And you could have looked at the empire at that moment in history and said, their best days are absolutely behind them. You can't recover from this, right? You invested so heavily in the war in the colonies and you lost. That's just a lost investment. You also lost the industries. British East India Company was drowning in debt, but owed to the UK government. It was a whole thing. Now, they found an economic boom. It happened to be the opium trade in China, but you could make an argument that without that, they wouldn't have survived. But because they were able to lever their Indian poppy colonies into opium production and sell to the Chinese by force, they found this new trade and an economic boom followed up, and they ended up having their best days still in front of them. Now, I don't think we're going to find that lever, but is there a productivity boom on the periphery somewhere, that strikes you as possible, Maya?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the unknown. We have no idea. Wouldn't that be great? And it is possible. And you hear all the time, like we could have a huge unleashing of productivity from AI. And so that's one that people point to all the time. The reality is, we're at AI. The chances are that comes with massive productivity growth, but also massive new costs that we haven't incorporated into our economic growth either. Like the cost of huge amounts of disinformation is very disruptive to an economy. And if there's huge amount of job loss or even turnover, which, enough serious people think will happen with technology being able to replace a lot of the labor, we'll need a huge amount of government spending to help people who cannot find jobs. Like if there just aren't as many jobs, that's going to huge new portion of the federal government that hasn't existed, or some incredible pain and poverty. So it's hard to see the productivity boom that will come that would solve these things. I absolutely hope, but as they say, hope is not a strategy. Like we are leaving ourselves dangerously vulnerable at a moment when the world is more dangerous than it's ever been. This is a weakness for us. This fiscal situation is a huge weakness for us. Wars are not fought on the ground the way they used to be, as much as they are with the ability to be economically resilient and digital. And so these things, and it's going to cost money for us to continue the digital growth that we need to do too, in terms of AI and cyber and all the different kinds of research and investment we need to be doing. So this is not a moment where it's wise to say it's really too hard to talk about raising the retirement age or getting rid of some tax breaks or putting in spending caps. So I'm just going to hope for a productivity boom. That makes me super nervous,
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a couple times the world's more dangerous than it's ever been. Earlier, I think you also said if we can't get our financial situation under control, I don't know how we remain as superpowers, something along those lines. When you look at the geopolitical chessboard right now, do you see countries beginning to hedge their bets and looking at the current world order and saying, it's looking more uncertain than we've ever seen it. Maybe it's time to hedge our bets, have some insurance policies, align with other nations, the ASEAN bloc, the BRICS nations, are you seeing a bit of collective activity in that regard? And what do you make of it?
You bet. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely the uncertainty, the tariffs, the whole changing nature of our relationships, particularly with our allies. That's having a huge cost. And the way that is likely to manifest itself in that the effects on the 10-year and the treasuries. We have so much debt we have to sell. The way that we finance our deficit spending of $2 trillion every year is that we issue those treasuries and we need people to buy them. On top of that, so much of our debt is short term. About 1/3 of our outstanding debt will turn over this year in the next 12 months. So you're issuing $2 trillion in new and you're turning over roughly $10 trillion in borrowing as well. You need people to be demanding those treasuries, as there is a foreign policy that is causing many, if not most, countries around the world to want to diversify. That is a huge risk to us. I am very concerned that the medium long-term rates will be going up, and that is going to be incredibly costly for us. And once we get in that scenario, it is hard to turn back.
Could you say, as an analogy, that the treasuries are like oxygen to the American economy?
Yeah, I haven't used that one. I think that's completely right. I think we're dangerously dependent on low rates. We've become addicted to low rates, and rates going up is the oh boy, we're in trouble. But yeah, we can't survive. It's like credit card teaser rate. We got lulled in. Rates were so low. You had smart people saying, don't worry, be happy, borrow more. It's free. It's just, people just have to ask themselves when they hear something it's just not plausible that it is free to borrow. You can borrow for investments, they don't pay off completely, but borrowing for investments, you could justify if you're not borrowing for consumption. But 85% of the federal budget is for consumption, not investment. So this borrowing is not growing the economy. It is being consumed. As I say to my kids who really don't love hearing about the debt anymore because they grew up with it, not their favorite topic. It's listen, the bottom line is my cohort and others around us just wanted to spend a lot of money and didn't want to pay for it. And that's what we've done. And that's what our plan is, to continue doing it until the markets make that impossible. And that is not a good plan. I wish I know that in politics, especially, it's very polarized right now. To say the most obvious thing, it's incredibly polarized. And that's leading two sides to not want to do anything hard because they both tell themselves it's so important we win these elections. The best way to win elections is to pander. And I got to out-pander the other side. So we're trapped in a polarization trap, I think, when it comes fiscally. I wish we could switch this to us whenever, as a political independent, especially in Washington, D.C., I'm pretty homeless in that way. But when people say us, I'm always like, oh, you mean us, Republican or Democrat? If we don't think us, U.S., the country, and realize that one of the important things for our country to be in a good spot with lots of choices is to fix our fiscal foundation quickly, we will pay a huge price. And I think our polarization and this is so important. It's so important. I beat you. It's so important. I beat you. Mm-hmm. I think that is taking, to speak of oxygen, all the oxygen away from the discussion and the momentum for us to rebuild as a nation. And that's, it's just incredibly dangerous. And it does keep me up at night. It concerns me deeply.
Yeah. It's almost I wrote down I like how you frame this earlier in our discussion and several times throughout. You strike me as adamantly nonpartisan, right? First and foremost, you are adamantly nonpartisan. The organization is as well.
Yeah, we really are. And I think it's important because I know when I'm reading other things, I try to read about policies that I care about and ones I don't understand. Not knowing where somebody's coming from is really important. We only have one agenda, and that is that we think the level of borrowing is dangerous. And to be clear, there are times you should borrow, but they're for economic reasons. If there's a huge recession, if there's a huge downturn, we usually won't borrow in the smartest way, but you need to borrow some to avoid things getting worse. But we are borrowing for political reasons, and that's so wrong. So we're very sort of singularly minded, and we leave the debate of should we have smaller government or bigger government? Should be more on healthcare or more on investment in human capital? Those discussions would not allow us. Like if I said, well, this is my preference, that wouldn't allow us to be nonpartisan. And it's just great to work in a place where our political balance is all over the map from the people who work here and on the board. But yeah, thanks for recognizing that, because it means a lot to us, and I hope it helps with our credibility.
Yeah, well, and you're setting an example, right, that other people could look to and say, oh, I don't have to join the red team or the blue team. Like there's a third option, I can think independently or just bipartisanly, that's a term, but no, I think
They're different. I'm with them on this issue and them on this issue, but not even, I just don't even want to think of it as them. I just don't know, you can't run a company by building a board of directors and then putting them in two teams and making them compete at the same time that they're doing the best thing for the company. You just can't. The structure doesn't work, and our parties have too much power, and our political leadership has too much power, and our elections don't end up reflecting the will of a lot of people. There are a lot of people in the center who are not about partisanship, but they sort of get drowned out. And I just think it's really harming the country.
Well, that's the voting for the lesser of two evils strategy. And I think more and more of us find ourselves there. Right. Your term politically homeless resonates with me, resonates with probably most of my viewers, to be quite honest with you. Recent election up in Canada, if not voting was a candidate, it wouldn't have won a vast majority in every single province in the country. Kind of a sign of the times. Last question on the Treasuries and geopolitics, and then maybe one on domestic issues to wrap up here. But if the Treasuries are kind of the Achilles heel, they have to stay attractive to the global market in order to keep this party going for a little bit longer. But we're having to issue more short-term treasuries because countries aren't willing to make that long-term bet like they used to. And that could change. We're sort of seeing a reshuffling of the geopolitical chessboard right now. Both Trump and Xi are touring the world, brokering new deals and trying to strengthen relationships, and with the same goal probably. But it's important to note that China is the second largest holder of U.S. treasuries after Japan.
That's right.
And the China-U.S. conflict seems to be the narrative that everybody wants to talk about. We're competing with, we're at trade war with, technology war with China. We need export restrictions, import restrictions, tariffs, all this stuff. Meanwhile, we need them to keep buying U.S. treasuries. And look, one is the biggest supplier, the other is its biggest consumer. They're very interwoven. You can't just decouple. Do you have any perspective on that dynamic, though, and how much of a vulnerability that might be, Maya?
Yeah, I believe it's a strong vulnerability. I remember just when it started, previous time when Trump was in office and we were starting to have kind of the tariff war and we were fighting over soybeans. And I wrote an op-ed and was just thinking okay, the fight is over soybeans right now, but that could turn to treasuries at any moment. And they have a weapon in their toolbox, which we don't have. And people say, well, China would never dump treasuries because it would hurt them. But China has a different outlook in the world. They're willing to endure more pain for a longer run gain culturally than the U.S. is. And if they dumped treasuries, it could do real damage to us. And so, like you said, there is less demand. We're seeing that the world is diversifying out away from the U.S. That does mean that we are issuing more short-term treasuries. And part of the reason we're doing that is rather than issuing more longer-term, we're trying to keep the 10-year down. Janet Yellen, the Republicans were mad at Janet Yellen for doing this, and now Bessent's doing this. But they're issuing more short-term than normal. That keeps the 10-year rate lower than it otherwise would be because there's fewer that are being auctioned off. But it also means it has this short-term maturities where if rates go up, a greater portion of our debt will be turning over. And so the overall interest payments that we owe will be growing much more quickly. So again, the more short-term debt we have, if you worry rates are going up, and I do, that leaves us in a very dangerous position. So as we are dealing with the new geopolitical, geoeconomic dynamics, I think our vulnerabilities are increasing right now.
Okay. This has been great. Look, one thing you mentioned was we need a plan, right? A just in case scenario that we can roll out in that. What's the plan for the public, though? Because the politicians need a plan, the policymakers need a plan. Here's the mandatory cuts we're going to make in this XYZ scenario if we cross this red line, right? What's the today plan for the public? What would you tell somebody who's like, a lot of what you said sounds terrifying, and I hear you saying in a variety of ways that the runway ends soon, right? Maybe 9 years, whatever. What can I do today? What should I be doing today? What should I be paying attention to and actioning in my own life?
Yeah, that's a great question because we are building out. It's about public education and then public engagement. So we are working in a bunch of states, about 8 different states now, focusing on 2 things, which is trying to convince politicians not to borrow more. And we haven't started this, but we're going to start just an education effort on Social Security reform. You got to tell the truth on Social Security. I'm consumed with that. Tell the truth. There's no one answer. But tell the truth. We have to make changes. Pretending we don't is a huge disservice. So there's a couple things. We, on our website, have these interactive tools. And there's a bunch of them. But there are 2, the Social Security Reformer and the Debt Fixer, that allow people to go through and pick their own choices for how they would fix the problems.
Interesting.
I love them. I think they're surprisingly fun. Now, I'm a budget nerd, so of course I do. But I think you could have a Debt Fixer party, and it would be fun. We run those around the country. We do them with lawmakers. We do them on our own. We do them with bipartisan groups as much as possible. People doing that, people trying to do those, and then sending the results to their members of Congress is the big thing. So it always feels old school when I talk about this. But the bottom line is I work with a lot of members, and they're like, Maya, nobody calls us about this issue. We don't get, every phone call they get is, don't touch this. Give me this tax break. Start this spending program. It is clearly never the agenda that we are pushing. If they just get a few people saying, I'm worried about the national debt, there are actually a lot of them who would like to figure out ways to do something because they know that this is serious. There's also a lot who don't care and are happy to kick the can. But there are a lot of responsible ones there. They need to hear from people. And there needs to be a sort of virtuous cycle of if they hear that anyone cares, then members will start talking about it a little bit more in their districts. I recently did town halls with Blake Moore from Utah and Jimmy Panetta from California. Different members, both excellent on the issue. So once you can get more people who are starting to talk about this issue, then we come to the obvious conclusion. It has to be done in a bipartisan way. It's way too hard for one party to do on its own. And then we on the outside can start socializing these ideas. Yes, raising the retirement age should be on the table because we can't retire at 67, which is the age now, and live to be 99. But we're not going to do it for somebody who's about to retire. We can start putting some of these ideas. They're not fun. They're not as fun as huge tax cuts and unpaid for new programs. Mm-hmm. But we need them to become more normalized, and we need to hear from people which things do they care about. So if they do the Debt Fixer or the Social Security Reformer, and they send those answers to their member of Congress, they can say, these are the things that we think we should do. I think crowdsourcing the ideas is kind of a nice way to get people both educated and engaged on it.
Yeah, 100%. And that's at crfb.org.
Yeah, CRFBA. Best acronym ever, CRFBA. I didn't come up with a name, but I would have tried to come up with a more memorable name. But CRFB, Committee Responsible Federal Budget.
crfb.org, the Debt Fixer, the Social Security Reformer. I think that's great. And yeah, I'd love to see some kind of public competition, right? Where people are competing to present different outcomes. I've been
doing this job forever. You just came up with a great, that's an excellent idea.
Yeah. And
okay, you will see that happen.
Well, so everybody watching, go do it. crfb.org, go hit the Debt Fixer or the Social Security Reformer, plug in your scenarios, drop them in the comments. I'd love to see what you guys come up with. Yeah. Maya, look, this has been a pleasure. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you.
And deep diving into this with you. So thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing me on. It was a nice discussion. I really enjoyed it.
All right.
When you think about the difference of poor versus wealthy, we all wake up with 24 hours every day. And so then it comes down to the things that we're doing in those 24 hours. And a lot of it has to do with the mindset. What Dave Ramsey and every other financial advisor tells you to do is work for 40 years, save enough money so one day, hopefully, you could retire and live off of your savings. And if you're lucky enough, you'll die right around when your savings hit zero. I want to know that number down to the penny. Not, it's $10,000. No, it's not $10,000. It might be $7,479.27. I want to know that number.